just bleed. Some of Parker fighting for you and me. Patients need what the doctor has said. Safe access now to the meds they've read. One love, one fight, don't you delay. Rights for the people in every way. We stand tall, we won't back down. Safe access is the anthem sound. Safe access is the anthem sound. The struggle is real, so is the fire for health and hope. We climb higher, stand with the ones who can't stand alone. For every voice deserves a throne. Compassion leads where the laws resist. A healer's heart can't coexist with barriers blocking what we deserve. The people's needs must be preserved. One love, one fight, don't you delay. Rights for the people in every way. We stand tall, we won't back down. Safe access is the anthem sound.
This production is brought to you by DHBN, WTHC Radio, and Stoner Records.
Welcome back, you guys, to our weekly Patients for Safe Access podcast. And this week, my guest is the one and only Dr. Codi Peterson. Thank you, Codi, for being on our podcast today. I'm excited to have you as a guest.
I like being a guest, so this is a good one too. Thanks for showing up every week to have these important conversations.
Oh, absolutely. We love having the important conversations. We talk about all kinds of things on this podcast, but today we're going to talk about you and several of your ventures in the industry of cannabis. So I met you last year in September of 2024 with the Americans for Safe Access organization. And by the way, that can be found at safeaccess.org. So please take a look, yes, and check them out. Tons of material. I came across them because I was having some issues in the cannabis industry, and I started looking at all their brochures and all their flyers and all the educational material that ASA had out there. And I was just blown away by it. I became involved, became a member of ASA myself, and got to come out to Washington, D.C. for the Validated Voices Summit that ASA held, which is where I met your beautiful face. So tell me about your journey with ASA and how long you've been a part of ASA and stuff.
Yeah, that's a really good question. My first in-person event with Americans for Safe Access was also in September of last year. That was my first in-person event. Now, I've been kind of bumping into ASA in my journey to become a cannabis science professional, and a couple times throughout there. So going back to my education at University of Maryland, Baltimore, where I got my master's in cannabis science. That's when I first bumped into Americans for Safe Access, and they sort of led and helped teach our advocacy class. And so part of this master's degree is also learning how to advocate, how bills work through the system, how to share your voice. And so that was my first exposure to ASA. And then, just by happenstance, what happened is during that journey of trying to figure out how all of these politics work, I ended up stumbling into sort of the leadership at ASA, starting some early conversations, and then that September, finally was able to meet Steph Scherer, the current CEO. That's probably the wrong term. Our leader, director, and was really kind of convinced that it was time to do more and time to step up out of a national level instead of sort of where I'd been focusing, which was at the state level. So I just really think it's critical that we all get involved, because even though it feels like this fight is done, that's not true. Change is afoot. It's all happening. You can look around the country and see how much change has happened since 1996 when California legalized medical cannabis. However, these 23 years have been marked by a lot of change in advocacy. And with ASA, however, it's still not over the finish line. The federal government still sees marijuana, in this stupid language that they use, as federally legal if it contains greater than 0.3% THC. And I think that's just a travesty. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't line up with our other drug policy. So I wanted to get involved. I showed up to Lobby Day in September of 2024, met you and a bunch of other really great people, and decided to jump in. And since that time, I've joined the board of directors, and we're working hard to try to, create value and stir interest in true medical cannabis reform in America.
I don't think a lot of people understand, like, Americans for Safe Access has been in this journey for decades now of just getting the access to medical cannabis legalized, for us as patients. They have been in this fight for a very, very long time. Steph Scherer, the founder of ASA, has been boots in the ground, dog fighting it out, year after year, going to cannabis policy summits and speaking with, legislators in DC on behalf of medical cannabis. The amount of research and reports and data that Americans for Safe Access has compiled is absolutely mind-blowing, and the amount of funds that she's been able to secure and put into that fight is astronomical. And I just want to say that she inspired me entirely. Meeting her, the other Americans for Safe Access members is truly what built Patients for Safe Access in my head. You know what I mean? That's where that came from.
Well, that's really powerful, and I would agree. When I met Steph, she really impressed me, but not just with her intelligence or her wherewithal. It's her persistence. Mm-hmm. This is a 23-year-long battle for her at ASA, and very few other advocacy groups, probably any, have been around that long fighting for the same thing, which is fair, equitable, and legal access to cannabis medicine. And really the focus in recent times has been, now that a lot of the barriers to this being acceptable have been broken down. An example of that would be global treaties. No longer is cannabis listed in like the highest category of controlled substance internationally. It's been downgraded to sort of the least controlled. And these treaties were a holdup. It was a reason the federal government couldn't change their position. But those are gone now. Another example would be the FDA and the Health and Human Services saying that cannabis has no medical use, but that's not true in 2020.
Right.
It's no longer true. In 2022, the FDA came out and said that there is currently accepted medical use, CAMU, for medical cannabis, and that's critical because that is one of the major criteria for changing the schedule of the drug. A reminder to everyone listening, according to the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, marijuana is a Schedule I drug. So that's a drug that is highly addictive or has a high potential for abuse. That is a drug that has no currently accepted medical use. Okay? So in that category is psychedelic mushrooms, MDMA ecstasy, illicitly produced fentanyl, although that's kind of complicated too, because fentanyl does have a medical use according to the FDA and technically falls into Schedule II, which is kind of crazy when people, they don't realize this. But I'll give you another example that'll make your eyes big, Summer. Methamphetamines is technically a DEA Schedule II medication, so less restricted than marijuana because there is a currently accepted medical use. In that case, methamphetamines has been FDA approved for attention deficit disorder. And so there is definitely some disconnect between the current regulatory policy and where we're at sort of publicly in America, right? Especially since 2018, things got even more confusing because the legislation at that time passed the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill. And look, I think that there's tremendous strides built into the Farm Bill. We really took cannabis to the next level, so to speak, allowing it to be sold in essentially bars or, in certain states. And depending on what state you're in, they're just taking marijuana, THCA flower, and selling that over the counter. That is progress. But what happens is when the federal government has this opposing stance, everyone's building their business on, call it a shanty town on stilts, that unfortunately could come crumbling down with maybe, say, a new administration or the way the political winds shift in this country. So my fear is that we're going to have even more pain in this process, and that's why we need true federal reform.
I would agree. That was one of the things that Asa talked about a lot was, federal legalization or descheduling. We even in our meetings when we were all conversing, we even talked about and threw out the words Schedule 6, about creating a whole new schedule for cannabis and psilocybin and other plant-derived, medications.
Right. Cannabis is leading the way, but if anyone's paying attention, mushrooms are
right on its
trailing the wind, right? They're in the draft being created by marijuana. And right now the regulatory framework is not prepared to have this conversation, even though we're seeing almost step in step similarities, including, the medicalization of these and the decriminalization, just like we saw in the early days of marijuana. We're seeing the same thing for mushrooms. And currently the DEA and FDA do not have a framework where these are going to fit. And one thing that Asa is doing is proposing a new schedule for this cannabis, but then also setting up a framework that would allow other natural products like mushrooms, or kratom, which is currently totally legal, but kind of gaining its own version of backlash,
Right.
and set up a regulatory framework that makes sense, acknowledging that there might be some potential for abuse, but also acknowledging the medical utility. I think, okay, so some things that people might not understand, and I just shared an article. I'm sure the hippie in the background running this thing is going to share it for me. This article was written, thank you, the hippie. And so all cannabis use is political at Cannigma.com. That's my and my friend's publishing outlet. What I want you to take away from this article, one of the biggest things that I think people don't know, is marijuana remains a Schedule I substance, right? That super controlled, no medical use. There's a lot of winds changing, but the DEA still classifies it as such. The only reason a medical marijuana business can function out of New York or California or any state in the U.S. is because of what's known as the CJS Amendment, also known as the Rohrabacher-Farr Amendment. No one knows this, and this is crazy. All medical marijuana's legality is a one-line item in the federal criminal justice system budget. That is one single line that says, federal funds will not be used to enforce state legal medical marijuana laws. Okay, so the states, we did this federalist thing where the states have taken over and said, no, marijuana is legal in California, and you can get a card and you can get a recommendation and yada, yada, yada. The only thing keeping that standing is this single line that says we won't use federal money. But even more than that, there is currently zero protection existing on a federal framework that says that adult use marijuana is safe from federal prosecution. There's nothing even on the books saying that. So again, if political winds shifted tremendously, and I don't know if you noticed, it's a little gusty in America right now, things can change. And so we are not boxed in, we are not safe and secure, and we have to continue to strive to create the market which we seek to create. So for ASA, Americans for Safe Access, the group we're kind of focusing on here, that means creating a new schedule, a Schedule 6, something that is certainly not in the same class as fentanyl or in the same class as ketamine, which is currently being kicked around, but one that acknowledges the adverse effect profile and the small potential for abuse and so many other things, but also creating access in a way to integrate cannabis medicine into healthcare. And these problems are real. Not to jump ahead, Summer, but if you saw my post on LinkedIn today, received a text message last night from the mother of a young boy, a patient of mine. So this kiddo was 2 when we first started seeing him. He had a severe epilepsy condition. He was having 40 plus seizures a day, despite big doses of traditional pharmaceuticals. They couldn't quite get it right? They couldn't figure out the seizures. We added some cannabis medicine and helped bring down the seizures and a lot, but not all the way. Then we added another agent. It was kind of a journey, right? But over the course of 6 months, we got Benny, who's this little 2-year-old at the time, what I'm talking about, to be seizure-free. Okay, and he's been that way except for one seizure in the whole last 3 years, and he was sick that time, so he gets an excuse. Cannabis medicine worked for him. However, I got a text message just last night from this mother saying, hey, the product that I've been using, which is something out of Colorado that's CBG dominant, is no longer available. They won't ship it to California because California just made this rule how if it contains any detectable amount of THC, it's illegal to sell it here. So now my patient, a little boy who's got his seizure medicine, is no longer accessible to him. And then they need someone like me. Fortunately, I'm still on their team to help them navigate, well, what's a comparable product? Where can I get it? Where can I get it safely and consistently? These are not easy asks. These are not simple solutions, right? It's going to take a keen eye and practice and experience to help these patients. And Benny is not unique. Benny is a dime a dozen. There's so many people out there that could benefit, do benefit, have benefited, that are thrown into this mix because of this lack of, let's say, federal legality and standards. So
let me pause you there for just a second, because I want to be able to give a good amount of time to this conversation about Benny. We're going to take this to a quick commercial break and to a song. Our song today is going to be by Elevated Roots, and that's going to be Dankrupt, because who wants to be Dankrupt? I never want to be Dankrupt again. So let's pick up Benny in a minute, because this is something super serious and it deserves the time to talk about it.
Thanks.
Every single day, 22 veterans take their own lives. Yesterday it happened, it'll happen again today and tomorrow, unless we do something. Operation Heal is on a mission to stop the pain, the death, and the heartbreak. Through the only thing that has actually worked for PTSD and chronic pain, cannabis. For far too many of our heroes, healing isn't an option. They're stuck in illegal states, living on a salary of $1,700 a month or less, denied natural medicine by the VA and force-fed pills instead. That's where Operation Heal comes in. Since 2023, they've built a nationwide underground network of cannabis caregivers and connections, getting veterans the plant medicine they need at zero cost when money's tight. Now they're going even bigger. VetStock is coming, a powerful event where veterans will come together to convert a school bus into a home for a fellow vet who sleeps on the streets every night. You can sign up for canna cooking classes, grab some awesome merch, and make a donation that directly saves lives. Go to Operation Heal, HEEL, and click to help our vets, to get involved, and help us bring plant healing to those who fought for us. This is for the people, by the people. No red tape, no politics, just action. Because the government hasn't just abandoned our vets, they've abandoned all of us. Operation Heal. We don't stop until they stop dying. Join the movement. Donate, share, and heal.
Oh man, that looks like it's our last one, man.
That is our last one, man.
Good thing we can scrape the pipe, bro. Never gonna be bankrupt again. 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 Gee! morning had to scrape my pipe. Knew that when I went to bed last night. Had a premonition in my head that I never gonna wake bankrupt again. Jumped on my bike and pedaled downtown, on the lookout for the one John Brown. Found him in a corner parking lot, smoking spliffs. Him said, "Here, man, you want to take a hit?" I said, "I'm never gonna be bankrupt again. Never gonna be bankrupt again. Never gonna be bankrupt again. Never gonna be bankrupt again." Went back home to put the seeds in the soil. Compost recipe from brethren I know. Water pH to 6.1. Jah in control of the ebb and flow. Planting seeds, putting flower in my hand so that I will never awake bankrupt again. I said I'm never gonna be bankrupt again. 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 Always bring a flower to my friends. Always connecting to the music of medicine. Always finding ways to sing. Positivity and healing vibes. Always attracting my tribe. Always vulnerable to the tides. Always accountable for my strides. Holding on, not folding beyond. Letting go and letting you know. Bankrupt isn't never gonna be a part of my flow. I said I'm never gonna be bankrupt again. 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 Driving around, I see John Brown. Him said, dead a man. Him said, him never gonna be bankrupt again. I said, hey John Brown, can I give you a hand so that you yourself will never be bankrupt again? I said, never gonna be bankrupt again. 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 Wah!
Am I the only one who enjoyed that too much?
I never want to be bankrupt again.
Yeah,
So,
well, I think allowing patients to grow their own is a good way to prevent this sort of bankruptcy.
I second that. Thank you, Elevated Roots, for that music. That's a great song. We had one of our comments on here. Somebody said, addicted to the song. I think we all are. Once we've heard it once or twice, we're like, vibing to it every time. So for those of you tuning in late, this is Dr. Codi Peterson, and he is joining us on our weekly Patients for Safe Access podcast. Take a moment, if you would, please, and hit like and subscribe on the WTHC Radio YouTube platform. And Codi, would you like to put any of your socials out there so that people can follow you, and then we'll start talking about Benny?
Yeah, I think that my personal and my professional would be great. So cannabis, your favorite plant, and PharmD, that's PharmD. That's my doctorate in pharmacy. Cannabis PharmD put together, that's on Facebook and Instagram and all the places. And then if you're interested in more basic education, understanding what all the ins and outs of cannabis, then I would recommend the Cannigma. So that's the words cannabis enigma kind of put into one. So CANNIGMA. It's in the list. It's on the start thing. Cannigma.com for all of your cannabis questions. If you go to those two places, that's great. You're going to hear me talk about Americans for Safe Access over and over while we're here today as well. And that's safeaccessnow.org if you are looking to go there. I would say the plug that I really want to do, Summer, the plug that I really want to give is we need members. Anyone who's listened to this and it resonates what we're talking about, this is at the bottom of that. It's all over what we're going to be talking about today, is joining Americans for Safe Access. For just $23, you get a year's membership, and you can help contribute and support this yeah, that we're trying so hard to rally engagement around them. We do lobby days. You can see that being highlighted on the screen right now. We just did a lobby day where everyone, again, went to Washington, D.C. And talked to their congresspeople in person. I've done this. Go ahead, Summer.
I actually had members, well, not I had, but members from our Patients for Safe Access team were at that day of lobbying again. Austin Jones and Kyle King. They both traveled out to DC for that event.
I love it. And look, it wasn't a huge event. We're really trying to rally the troops. People are feeling, and I kind of was getting this, that we've kind of done the work, right? Marijuana's never been more accessible. It's never been more accepted. So people are assuming that we're done. But as Benny's story shows, and numerous other patients, that's not necessarily true. Cannabis has definitely become accepted, but not at a federal level, which still puts our veterans at risk, right? You could lose your VA benefits. You can be labeled as a drug addict just for consuming marijuana. Yep. You can't own a firearm, as crazy as that is, depending on what state you're in, and have a medical marijuana card. This is crazy. These individuals can drink alcohol, which we know is strongly associated with gun violence, and there is no existing data strongly supporting that connection in the other way. So I think there's so many disconnects between where we are federally and where the public perception is. And this is why ASA is so important, why we need you to get involved, and why doing nothing is not an option, right? We're in this point where policy doesn't match public perception, and only we, in a democracy, only we can make the steps that needed to change it. Now's that time for sure. The hippie, you're awesome over there. I love what you're
Hippie is just following right along, man. I'm loving it today.
This is a good example. So the 2025 Patients First Compassionate Agenda, this is what ASA would like to do. I challenge you, if you're listening to this and any of this resonates, you got to follow the link and join for $23 a year. But for key priorities for the POTUS, and remember, the president can't change the scheduling. That has to come from Congress. But for the president, he could stop evicting medical cannabis patients from federal housing. And that is indeed happening. Medical marijuana consumers are discriminated against, can't use their sort of government provided benefits on that. VA doctors to recommend cannabis. Right now, anytime a veteran is using cannabis, even if they're not discriminated against, which happens a lot, even if they're not, it's a look away, can't talk about it, whatever. You go to the same doctor, that doctor's in a state where it's legal. We need to empower these physicians to be able to recommend cannabis. Stop 100%. Testing federal employees for cannabis. Why is cannabis a 30-day window, a 60-day window, excluding federal employment, when we know that cocaine and opioids are out in just a few days? Right? It doesn't make sense. We need to rethink the way that we're testing for cannabis. And I would argue, ASA would argue, stop. And then, ask Congress for comprehensive medical cannabis legislation. That's kind of one thing we can have the president do, but comprehensive reform has to come from Congress. Here you can see a few really important things. Let's start at the top here, key priorities for Congress that ASA feels they need to do. We know that HHS has said that cannabis has currently accepted medical use, but they need to do something so they can pass the CJ and CJS amendment, right? Extend the protections for medical marijuana businesses around the country. They can then allow rescheduling process to happen, right? Congress can and does have an impact on how this happens. We need to ensure they're supporting. In 2022, we passed something known as the 2022 Research Act. It said that we were going to start looking into the medical benefits. We were going to start doing the work, and $0 have been spent on that Research Act.
Let me ask you on that, because that's something that we struggle with here in our state and Oklahoma as well, is they did a study on how much marijuana was too much marijuana grown, which they said we had 32 times the amount of marijuana needed for our medical patient card holders at the time. I think this was in 2023. We would have had 370,000 patient card holders at that time. They do not. There are so many programs, like the lady that was on last week with me. Her name is Jamie Bennett, and she does Operation Zero, Cancer Playbook, and stuff like that. This woman has years of data and research available, of medical data and research that could, be used for the benefits of cannabis research, and there is not a single dollar available to the research for the benefits of. But yeah, they can spend dollars on the bullshit of, we grew too much. Why is that? Yeah,
there's a real challenge, but I would say the biggest barrier in front of everyone is anytime you give medicine to humans, you've got to get institutional research board approval, right? So you've got to get this sort of safety step out of the way. But because marijuana is a Schedule 1, right? Because it's this federally legal with no acceptable use, nobody really wants to touch it. Even if that's retrospective work, kind of bringing in the data. If it was done outside of the traditional regulatory frameworks that would involve in scientific research, most institutions are not going to take that data and consider it viable.
What schedule is Marinol?
Marinol is a Schedule 3 drug. And so, again, Schedule 3, a good example of a comparator would be ketamine or anabolic steroids are two examples of other Schedule 3s. The problem there is, one, nobody's using Marinol, right? They're using cannabis, botanical cannabis. And for some reason, botanical cannabis remains a Schedule 1, but synthetically made THC, Delta-9 THC, the same stuff found in the smoke of flower, that is considered Schedule 3. But when it's the botanical version, it's still a Schedule 1, which puts up a lot of barriers, which is, again, the crazy state of affairs and the reason why we need to continue to push for true federal reform.
I just find it so interesting that big pharma can take the medical benefits of, the plant and make a pharmaceutical version of a synthetic version of, the cannabis derivative of, to get the medical benefits. But yet, if we try to prove the medical benefits from the plant itself, we're all shut down for that.
Yeah, or just like barriers upon barriers upon barriers. There has been a little bit of research done. I know Dr. Sue Sicily, one of the sort of pioneers in this research side of things, finally got her cannabis flower in veteran study approved after a decade of fighting to try to do this. And they just recently went to this approval. It's going to be a couple years, I'm sure, before we get any results from this. But this is one of the world's leading researchers. She has her own special licenses. Yay. And even she's butted up against all these barriers, and it takes a decade to get one of these studies approved. But that is definitely one of the big progress points. Just to touch on what's on the screen right now, I love the work that Steph did here, trying to help guide people, because people are like, what do I say to my Congress people? Here are ACE's 6 goals, and I encourage you to align with them. But there's so many ways to get involved and to push forward any of these sort of 1 through 6 as you were looking at here. This hemp program, look, Americans for Safe Access is not anti-hemp or pro-marijuana. We are patients first and patients focused. Mm-hmm. If the Farm Bill creates access to medicine, which in the case of Benny, who we heard about earlier in this, it created access, then we don't want to claw those back. We want to ensure that those benefits to patients can stay, right? So we need to pair with a overall regulation reform, not take away the Farm Bill because only marijuana is good and hemp is bad. That is not where we stand, and I think most advocates don't feel that way.
I would agree.
We know that the FDA has a long-standing bias. We kind of already talked about where we're going. The DEA has a long-standing bias. So ASA really wants to push for novel reform and creating a new office within Health and Human Services, but not under FDA, because this isn't a food or drug per se, right? This is a medicine, an herbal medicine, a botanical medicine, and put a new office in the Office of Medical Cannabis and Cannabis Control. Right? Create new standards, create standards that apply specifically to this industry and botanical medicines. Don't put everything into this FDA lot, because the idea that marijuana doesn't have enough research done on it is kind of asinine when you think about the fact that there's 20 million Americans using it today. Right. All multiple times today. So this medicine that we're talking about, cannabis, doesn't fit into the food and drug box that the FDA has created, and we're big proponents that it come outside of there. So we want Congress to hear us and say, hey, we do want reform, but we don't want just another FDA drug. FDA oversees tobacco. They haven't exactly nailed it.
I could tell you some shit about tobacco, honey. We've been testing that stuff too, and we have so far 100% of the products have failed. Meaning that, like, we only tested 4 so far, in tobacco, but, like, all 4 failed for heavy metals or pesticides. So, like, I could take you on a wild rabbit hole for hemp, tobacco, and medical marijuana. But we'll keep going with what you got.
Well, I think, to your point, is there's a lot of work to do to manage this, and FDA's track record is just abysmal. This is why we think that it belongs somewhere else. Here's 6 things that you can do right now. You're listening to this talk. Get online, and you can follow these. It's right below there, the hippie. Yeah, these 6 bullets here. If you have just a minute, you can share this campaign that we're talking about right now on social media. You can also, in the same amount of time, 1 singular minute, sign a petition. This petition will add weight to when ASA is lobbying in DC. In 5 minutes, you can actually write a short little briefer and write to the president and send it over to him, letting him know what we want him to do, those 5 points above. 10 minutes, you can tell Congress, okay? We have these tools ready to go. You click in there. All of a sudden, you're just putting in your name. You're putting in a couple of your own words. Maybe you're chat GPTing it. It's great.
I've done it. It's super easy,
It's
guys.
so easy. I wish more people would get on here and do it,
Yes.
because right now in DC, no one's hearing about this issue. Okay, cannabis is we're a very distractible bunch. I know that that applies to me. And frankly, we're all tied up dealing with our microcosm of a market. Maybe you're in, California, and you're in this dog-eat-dog hyper-competitive market. You don't have time to be thinking about federal reform. Same thing by creating these 45 different medical cannabis markets with different rules and different challenges. We haven't been able to focus on the big picture, which is, again, creating safe access, creating safer medicine, making it sure that people are not discriminated against for their use, treating cannabis like any other medicine, and reintegrating it into common sort of pathways.
Absolutely.
California's done some cool stuff in this regard. We have something called Ryan's Law. Are you familiar? Okay, Ryan's Law, SB 311, and then again SB 302. Doesn't matter. Congress and the governor and all of the California government got together and said, "Hey, you know what? Cannabis can be medicine, and we should stop discriminating against patients who use it, especially those who are at the end of their life." So in California, for terminally ill patients, those with a diagnosis which only has a year or less to live, so this is pancreatic cancer, severe dementia, you can come up with a number of reasons why someone might have this diagnosis, you can use cannabis medicine, non-inhalables, in the healthcare institution. So if you're in long-term care or palliative care, you're allowed to use a tincture. Doctors can't tell you no. They can't restrict it. Yeah, you get to bring in your product and use your product as you see fit if you're terminally ill. Now, I'd like to see that expanded beyond terminally ill, and California's done a little bit of that without getting too deep into what we're doing. It would be great if we could see laws like this around the country.
Yeah.
The reason I got into cannabis, it might be one of your questions later, so sorry for jumping ahead.
You're good.
It was in college. The woman I was dating, grandmother was struggling with pancreatic cancer. At the time, I had learned this new skill of making brownies and baked goods. My colleagues and friends around college liked it. And so we put them to use for grandma.
Yeah.
And, grandma was at the end of her life, stage 4 pancreatic cancer, unable to eat, was on a lot of morphine and lorazepam. It was causing a lot of sedation and sort of the stereotypical challenges from those medicines. And she said, "Hey, I used cannabis a long time ago. I'd be interested in trying it." We kind of pitched the idea. She said, "Yeah, go ahead and do it." And we got grandma this cake. I remember specifically. It was just a lemon cake that we made her. And she had the most beautiful 2 days before she died, on the 4th day.
Wow.
But those 2 days, she didn't need her Ativan, she didn't need her morphine. She had a full meal on 2 days in a row, which was so abnormal for her. It had been weeks or a month since then. And she called all of her children and grandchildren and shared stories and had conversations with them on the phone. And then she passed, right? So cannabis didn't solve this problem. Cannabis was a tool that provided dignity in the end of life, and it should be that way in all 50 states.
Yeah, I wish, I talked with my mom on Mother's Day on our podcast, and we talked about my grandmother, whenever she passed, and had cannabis been an option for her at the time of her passing, we would have totally, been able to keep her way more comfortable without the liquid morphine, without the liquid hydrocodone, and all those other pharmaceuticals, you know what I mean?
The giggle bush. And I think that's a pretty good word for it. Yeah. And it's not to say that people don't need morphine and lorazepam and hydrocodone. All those are still tools. It's the fact that we've created this exception, this illegality around this plant medicine because it's not consistent enough, or because we say it's too scary, or because there's racist undertones going back 100 years. All of the things, all of those are reasons why we're struggling to effectuate this change. California has taken some big steps, but there's still a lot of work to do.
Yeah, of course. So, what is your personal take on federal legalization and rescheduling?
Oh, that's a loaded question. So I have a personal take and an ASA take, and I think they overlap a lot. Okay, my first statement is this. Anything that's not Schedule 1 is better than Schedule 1. Okay, so the current status of marijuana, the only reason it's legal is that one line item that could go away that we talked about earlier, the CJS amendment, which then puts all of us at risk, the entire industry at risk. So if we made it a different schedule, even if it was Schedule 2 or something ridiculous and inappropriate, right? That would still be a form of progress. But any progress comes with risks as well. And I do worry about sort of handing this whole thing off to the pharmaceutical industry or not thinking through all of the upcoming challenges that would come with a reschedule to 2 or 3. But I think that would be progress. So when the FDA and DEA were talking about this at the beginning of this year, while it's not my preferred, it's not my ideal, I found it to be a positive note. Now they paused all those hearings and they're no longer reconsidering it. They made, they were proposing Schedule 3, which I found to be, again, probably the wrong schedule for this substance. It's less dangerous than ketamine and less dangerous than anabolic steroids, but I could understand. In ASA's world, what we're trying to do is pass something known as the Medical Cannabis and Cannabinoid Act, which solves this problem not with a reschedule, but with a new schedule.
Yep.
And so the argument often is deschedule, DE, so stop scheduling, versus reschedule, change schedules. We don't think either of those solutions is perfect, and let me explain why. Rescheduling keeps it in a pretty highly restricted category. It could create, if it's a Schedule 2, for example, it could create monthly doctor's appointments in order to get a refill. And whether 2 or 3, you still don't have an FDA-approved product on the market. So we're up against years of potential barriers trying to get a botanical drug approved by the FDA and available to patients. So it really doesn't solve much today. There might be some tax benefits, though there's arguments to be made on both sides of that. In general, reschedule is not ideal. A lot of people would say deschedule is ideal, and I respect that. I understand that. However, I don't know that deschedule takes care of patients. Descheduling does not make it an approved medicine. It does not legitimize cannabis at all. It just throws it in the bucket with alcohol and tobacco, which again, in some ways, adults should be able to do what they want to do. I can see that rationale. However, what it doesn't do is it doesn't establish any of the protections that I just described. It doesn't support veterans and their access by descheduling alone, right? Just taking it off the list of drugs that are illegal does not make it a medicine. Yeah. And so that's one major concern. It doesn't affect the VA. It doesn't affect the gun ownership we talked about per se. Like it doesn't address a lot of the problems. So a new schedule, which by the way, isn't some crazy idea. This has been proposed multiple times in DC as a way to solve this problem. A new schedule, Schedule 6, puts it below the existing current framework, creates a new botanicalized definition for medical marijuana, is the word that we have to use federally.
I don't know why I use the word cannabis instead of marijuana.
Yeah, well, it's complicated. I will confess, because hemp, right? Hemp and marijuana, these are the same plant, all cannabis, sativa L. I do agree cannabis should be there, but because they descheduled hemp, now we're stuck sort of using the term marijuana. It's not a good term because it just means any cannabis plant with greater than 0.3% THC. But if you've ever grown a cannabis plant and looked at the analysis, that's most cannabis plants. Not all, but most of them will produce more than that. So I agree it's a silly term. I think cannabis leaves a little to be desired too, because it's not defining whether we're talking about sort of a hemp, fiber, or food variety versus the smokable flower. And if you go back a long time to the original definition, it was definitely leveraged for racist reasons and sort of stigmatization. But marijuana with a G is actually a Hispanic word predating the use of marijuana as a term. So kind of right now, due to federal definitions, we're a little bit stuck with that word, even though it's not my favorite.
Right. Well,
I want to just point out one more time that descheduling, taking cannabis all the way off the list and just saying, well, it's kind of like alcohol and tobacco. It doesn't legalize. There is no state to state to state continuity, right? In the same way that the alcohol rules are different in Utah than are different in Nevada. pretty different, right? We could find ourselves stuck with that, even as medical marijuana, even as a medicine. So there's a lot of challenges involved in trying to just say, oh, leave it up to the states. So by going to Schedule 6, creating a new schedule, we'd create a national definition of a medical cannabis product, and then states could continue to do what they want. One of the pearls that I think helps people understand why Schedule 6 is the way we want to go is in the language for the MCCA, the proposed bill, which is in Ledge Council. We're trying to get a champion in Congress. The language that we've decided in is it would create a full decriminalization for all cannabis offenses. And this is critical. No one should ever go to jail for a plant. Okay?
Thank you.
Yeah, period.
Thank
you. Also, you shouldn't be able to make plants illegal, right? I mean, this makes sense if it grows naturally. But kind of focusing on that, creating a Schedule 6, people say, oh, it shouldn't be scheduled at all. And we agree, but we can get the definition of medicine by creating a new schedule. And in the same breath, under the language defined in the MCCA, we would decriminalize all offenses. It doesn't mean you can sell a marijuana wherever you want and whatever to whomever you want. It would just stop criminal penalties at least at the federal level, and say that there is no reason to be criminal. We can just deal with fines or deal with the non-criminal offenses. Civil.
The only time that I think that someone should go to jail for the plant is when they're producing it on a commercial basis and they're producing product that they know has contamination in their product, and they submit that product to the retail space for shelves for the consumer to buy with the intent to consume. And at that point, you have willfully poisoned the people. And that, I think, is criminal and should be criminally accountable.
Yeah, and I first of all, knowing you and your story, I think that I understand how that could happen. And I do agree that maleficence, that might be the wrong word, willful harm is definitely, it just shouldn't fall into cannabis, right? If you did that with a drink, if you did that with a food, all of that would still apply. So it's less about sort of a marijuana offense and more about, but your point is valid, and I think all of that needs to be delineated and settled in courts. None of this is a simple solution. But we need to demand a solution because we are currently in this predicament. It's kind of a mess where we're at.
So, your background is in pharmaceutical and pharmacology and in pediatrics. So you want to tell us a little bit about where you began at?
Sure. It's still to this day, that's what I do. I practice pharmacy. I got my PharmD from Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, and I practice pharmacy in a pediatric hospital. So in the emergency department, overnights, I'm in the emergency department seeing kids that come in, whether they're hit by a car or have a seizure or whatnot. And so this is my by night job. And then by day, I'm out here educating, advocating about the utility of medical cannabis. And so I do think I bring a unique perspective to this conversation. I've done this for about 10 years. I've seen the harms, right? I see the 2-year-old who ate the gummies and accidentally comes in. I've seen cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. And I've also seen patients benefit tremendously from anti-seizure effects of cannabis, et cetera. So kids and cannabis is sort of my thing, yeah.
Right. You actually just reminded me of the conversation of cannabinoid hyperemesis is what I like to call it, instead of cannabis hyperemesis. So tell me what you've seen, with that throughout time and why CHS is an actual diagnosis. A lot of people fight that diagnosis. I fought it myself. I was recently diagnosed over maybe 4 months ago or so with it, and ceased consumption of cannabis for a couple of weeks. Fortunately, I was able to go back to smoking my cannabis without a flare-up of the CHS, and I've been okay, since then on it. But that's why I kind of contest whether or not I actually had CHS. But tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, it's a really complicated and kind of controversial story. But the short of it is CHS, cannabinoid, as you mentioned. It's not just from cannabis, it's from cannabinoids. CHS is a syndrome, which means it's not a disease, which we know sort of what happens and how it goes. It's a collection of symptoms. And that in general makes it kind of a challenging diagnosis. Another example of a syndrome is fibromyalgia, right? It's a collection of symptoms, but we don't really know what causes it. The collection of symptoms is abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting that doesn't respond very well to nausea medicines, and typically a hot bath compulsion. The only thing that makes people feel better is a really hot bath or shower. So that's sort of the cluster of things that we're seeing. Of course, I should note also that this is usually seen and usually associated with high dose, long-term cannabis use or marijuana use. So the vast majority of patients are consuming for 2, 3, 4, 10 years before developing CHS. And to be honest, that's sort of like the standard, what we know, and everything else we're just sort of figuring out. My group of friends and I, we got together and we did a big survey. So we did what, to our knowledge, is the largest survey of CHS patients ever. We're looking forward to publishing those results at the end of the year to kind of review who are these individuals, what are they struggling with, where do they live, how much do they consume. But we don't really know enough. And to your point, Summer, this is an increasing diagnosis. We're seeing it a little bit more. But also, there's a little bit of stigma here still. And some people, whether they have CHS or not, are getting that label because they are high dose or long-term marijuana consumers and they're vomiting with abdominal pain. Maybe hot showers help, maybe they don't. But some people are just getting slapped that label, which is unfortunate because it's a real thing. But by misdiagnosing, we're losing a lot of credibility. Right.
No, definitely with that. My thing with the cannabis hyperemesis is just the like I said, I have gastroparesis, and I actually have a gastric stimulator implanted into my abdomen. And so I've been dealing with uncontrollable nausea and vomiting episodes for a lot of years due to that, And when I go into the emergency rooms prior to being a cannabis patient, every time that anything was said about this, that was always my gastroparesis, Well, then as soon as I became a medical card patient holder and they notated that in my chart, every time that I went in, same symptoms, same way to alleviate them. I've always been a hot shower person with my gastroparesis. Okay, I'll state that right away. So as soon as I, start telling them all the ways that I alleviate it, which is the same way to alleviate CHS, then I'm automatically, a CHS person, and they're putting that on my diagnosis now instead of gastroparesis, which has been my diagnosis since 2012.
Right, and this is the challenge, that there's so many overlapping symptoms that, just by nature of an emergency department, which again is my practice setting, we're looking for the reason, we're looking for the treatment, we're looking to get you home, right? That is the nature. And because of that, mental shortcuts and cognitive bias can definitely play a role. And frankly, we don't fully understand CHS, who's at risk, who's developing it. Could it be that your underlying gastroparesis and cannabis use together facilitate a similar syndrome? Maybe. We haven't really researched that enough. But I think your example is salient and important, is that in 2012, I was gastroparesis. In 2014, I was gastroparesis. 2016, and then marijuana is legalized. Everybody's got it top of mind. And now all of a sudden, your same symptoms, your same presentation, you come in and, now it's a CHS diagnosis. And that's a reflection of these sort of changing, ambiguous sort of frameworks that we're working with.
Yeah, I didn't become a medical marijuana patient until 2019, whenever I came out of recovery. So. Yeah.
And so to speak to that a little bit, the internet is abound with reasons that people have developed CHS. One of the biggest scapegoats, I'm going to use that word, is neem oil. And I think that there's reason to be concerned around contamination in cannabis. That is 100% valid. Whether it's contamination with things used to make that concentrate, like an acid used in conversion, or whether it's heavy metals, which can be found, in an improperly regulated soil that find their way into the herb. There's a lot of reasons to be skeptical, but at this time, there's no good connection putting pesticide exposure and CHS together.
That's what I was going to ask you.
Yeah, go ahead.
That's what I was going to ask you.
Yeah, so just I think the most compelling point out of the research that we did, we surveyed almost 1,200 people with CHS. Okay. And we asked all of them, when you developed CHS, where were you getting your weed? 50% said the legit market. Sorry, the legit, I hate that. The licensed marijuana markets in states. 25 to 30% were still getting their weed from the same guy they were getting it from before, right? So we'll call it the illicit market.
Right.
And then, we had a small but real subsection of people getting their products online from the hemp market or from their home grow. Although it was very small, there was a small portion of people who developed CHS smoking exclusively their own homegrown medicine. Right. And that argues strongly against the contamination. Not to say no one uses pesticides at home, but you could imagine if you're smoking your own.
Did they test their own nutrients and things like that? Did they test their water?
No, the level of research and rigor has not been done, period.
There's none, so there could be contaminants that they are unaware of and unknown to them.
I think that's valid. However, then the question becomes is take out the home grow. Let's look at the adult use people, right? The people buying from the state market. Why is it that only this small portion of people going to the illicit market are getting sick and not everyone who's consuming those same products?
I don't think too many people in the illicit market who will raise their hand and say, that's why I got sick. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I've certainly met those individuals too. Yeah, that they weren't sick before switching. I guess to my point is we don't know what causes it. And it's not really my primary concern. What I'd like to do is help people identify the symptoms, identify when they have developed it, and help empower them to find a new balance, right? Some individuals we surveyed, we said, well, what'd you do? Well, we got, again, 1,000 people. What'd you do after you found out you had CHS? Some people didn't quit and kept vomiting. Some people switched their source and switched their habits and they were able to keep consuming. Some people tried to quit, went back and just kept being sick. So there's the whole spectrum of experiences, and not even one solution has been consistently helping. Right? Yeah. It's not like, I went to organic and everything got better, though there are a few patients who report that. And so it's been a real challenge. And my hunch is because my theory is that this syndrome is associated with an imbalance in the endocannabinoid system, your master regulatory system.
Yes.
And could there be pesticides contributing? Sure. Could THC be contributing? Seems likely. And all together, it swirls into this syndrome. No good answers here, but hope to shed some light on what our concerns are, who's most at risk. One thing that I thought was pertinent is when in our survey we found over 97% of people are everyday consumers. And so, mitigating our use might be one way to help reduce the frequency of that.
Yeah.
Which it makes some common sense. It's a little bit harder said than done. Again, marijuana is an amazing medicine. It's not a perfect one. It does come with, in the wrong disposition, some potential for abuse or addiction. And it can cause significant side effects in certain individuals at risk of psychosis, people with really damaged hearts, really old hearts. THC can cause rapid heart rate and be concerning. So, I really just wish we could go about this with a sense of rationality instead of finger pointing and discrediting patients' experience. But also, I think we need to do a better job of not discrediting, I want to say, community knowledge and community experience. That's really important as well.
No, it's absolutely critical. I mean, the whole point of learning about the stuff is because there's somebody before you that came through this and went through something similar, and you're learning from them and about them. So, well, Codi, thank you so much. Charlie, what did you say that you wanted to ask real quick?
You want to talk about Delta 8?
We associated yours with that raspberry farm.
Oh, okay. So he wanted me to tell you about whenever they diagnosed me with the CHS stuff, upon deduction of things in my life that I was consuming at the time, we've pretty much determined that we think that it had to do with the Geek Bar or Raz brand, like salt nicotine vape, specifically the Raz one. I was getting sick immediately after like hitting my vape, within like 3 to 5 minutes, I would get sick and stuff like that. So we actually have some product, the sponge. I don't know if you knew this or not, but have you ever
Inside of all those vapes, there's a
oh my
sponge.
God, is it not horrifying? There's a fucking sponge in there. But anyways, so our lab guys were really nice, and they sent that off to 2 different colleges to have that product tested to see exactly identify the sponge, what it is. Because if it's a PVC sponge material,
yeah,
then it's, I guess, considered a class 1 or level 1 toxicity for us. And so that's a huge concern, for all of those people who quit smoking by using a vape device and then instead maybe are harming themselves way worse.
Yeah, there is a certain percentage that we found of nicotine consumers in this cohort, although it's far from everyone. Of people we surveyed about CHS. I think setting marijuana aside and looking at these vaporizers, I think you bring up a really good point. This mesh, we don't know what's in there. The constituents that are in these products are not well tested or well regulated. In fact, in California, they're all illegal, right? And but they're still highly available. So then the question becomes well, what quality assurances do we have on that side? And once again, I would say, everyone remember, this is the FDA is in charge of regulating these nicotine products, and they haven't exactly crushed it in their track record. But yeah, I think that there's so many questions and opportunities in the cannabis space, and we need to kind of take a step back from warring with each other. Oh, hemp, marijuana, and going at it, and starting to try to really solve the issues that are facing the entire industry
as a whole,
and as a unified team that's pro-cannabis. And I'm biased, but I really think that ASA's plan to medicalize is the proper step forward today to set the federal standard as this is a medicine. I think would go a long way to pushing this shared agenda forward. And I also want to point out that historically, medical cannabis has always been a win for everyone who's interested in cannabis. That's how we got here. Why abandon the strategy when we're this close to getting federal reform? Keep to the strategy, email your representative, call them, text them, whatever you have to do, and tell them, hey, medical cannabis is an issue for me. Let's get some reform on the agenda. And ASA has written the MCCA and has all these tools available to you to leverage.
Yep. So, guys, please check that information out, excuse me, on safeaccessnow.org. And that's going to be where you find all of the Americans for Safe Access information at. Cody is one of their board members. Again, I met him through Americans for Safe Access, or a day of lobbying and day of advocacy. And I'm so blessed to have met you, to learn from you, to continue to, hear your story as well. So, Cody, thank you so much for being our guest today on our Patients for Safe Access podcast.
Summer, it was awesome talking to you. You asked good questions, and I can just tell you have sincerity. You really want to see, a thriving industry, one that's thinking of patients, that's thinking of health, and it shines through in everything you do.
Oh, thank you, love. All right. Or the hippie, you can take us out of here, all right?
Get us out of here, hippie.
Yeah, get out of here.
Thanks, everybody.
Absolutely. Cody, I'll catch you on the phone later.
Catch you.
Stepping up strong with a righteous plea. Summer Parker fighting for you and me. Patients need what the doctor has said. Safe access now to the meds they've read. One love, one fight, don't you delay. Rights for the people in every way. We stand tall, we won't back down. Safe access is the anthem sound. Safe access is the anthem sound. The struggle is real, so is the fire for health and hope. We climb higher, Stand with the ones who can't stand alone, for every voice deserves a throne. Compassion leads where the laws resist. A healer's heart can coexist with barriers blocking what we deserve. The people's needs must be preserved. One love, one fight, don't you delay. Rights for the people